the first black manager in the central office in Delaware. Right. There were black female managers, but the first black male manager in the central office. They always had operators in the telephone company, but they didn't have any black operators in the telephone company. But so that was when the NAACP came in.
Since there were so many blacks who used the telephone service, that they should also be represented. And I told them in a polite manner that if we did not consider changes, then we had 3,000 people signed up to call and say they did not need telephone service anymore.
And forced them to hire black operators, and that's where Nancy Harris came in. Many years before I came with the telephone company, she broke the cycle for the women. And she, in Delaware, they had black female managers elsewhere, but in Delaware, they did not. She broke that first cycle. And I had to do the same thing within the central office. I know it's hard to believe that in 1972, the telephone company was still going through that kind of thing, but that's the way it was. As time went on, AT&T, they broke up the telephone company into separate companies. AT&T became a section of its own, and when that happened, then I got transferred to the Washington area, and I worked in Washington, I worked in Virginia, and I had a CO in Washington D.C., and I had that for several years, and then it was another split of the company. My name is Norwood Sloan, and most people refer to me as Woody. I'm 78 years old, and I've managed to retire from 2 careers. My first career was with the United States Air Force from 1949 until 1969, and my second career was with Diamond State Telephone Company. At that time, Diamond State Telephone Company consisted of 3 telephone companies, Bell Atlantic, Diamond State, and AT&T. I was part of the AT&T group. How I came to work for the telephone company was that in 1972, the telephone company was under court order to hire more management people in Delaware. The problem was, even though they were under court order to hire more managers in the technical field, their excuse was that they couldn't find anyone qualified. Now, to me, that didn't make sense, because they had plenty of Afro-American technicians working in the telephone company, and to me, they could have promoted them. But since the telephone company in Wilmington was totally controlled by families, uh, that they were using that excuse to not promote anyone. I was approached to come to work for the telephone company, uh, and when I was approached to come with the telephone company, I had to think long and hard about it because it would have been a tremendous pay loss. However, Mr. Houlihan, who was the CEO of Diamond State Telephone Company at the time, he sat down and we talked about it, and one of the things that we talked about was why he wanted me to come to work for the telephone company, and but he also wanted he wanted someone that was willing to make some sacrifices in coming with the telephone company for the reasons that he wanted me there. The reason he wanted me there, he wanted to break the cycle. He himself was under a lot of pressure to hire black managers into the communications field in Delaware. We had black managers working in Philadelphia under the Bell telephone system in Philadelphia, but they were lacking in the Delaware area. So one of the things that we talked about was me coming to work for them, and the reason he wanted me is because I had just retired from the military, and he felt that I could handle the pressure that was going to come with the job. And he wanted, and one of the things, I had the qualifications as far as communications was concerned, because my entire 20 years that I worked in the Air Force, I worked as a communication technician. So there was no doubt that I was qualified in communications, but I just was not qualified in communications in regards to the way the telephone company did communications. The thing that made me made me very doubtful about starting this job was at the time I was working for Spitz Laboratories. At the time they had hired me to travel around the country installing planetariums, because at that time we were well into the space age. And I was going into different colleges and high schools and hiring a crew when I got there and installing 40-foot, 60-foot planetariums. I would have to take a tremendous pay cut to come to work for the telephone company. So I had to really think harder about that. Started attending college at Goldie Beacon College, and in the management field. Mr. Houlihan promised me that the day that I graduated, that would be the day I graduated, that they would place me in management within the telephone company. And they were true to their word on that. The day I graduated, he placed me into management, even though they didn't have a job for me in management. So to do that, he placed me into the telephone company, and he placed me in a training management category where I was traveling around doing all of the management jobs within the telephone company. First I went to pole climbing school, then for a while I was working in engineering, and then I was working in the central office for a while, and I was just doing everything that they had to do. And eventually, true to his word, the first opening came up in the central office, which was definitely my field. I was hired. He brought me in and made me a manager within the central office. The Afro-Americans that were working as technicians or as draftsmen or whatever they were working in, other than management, they all were pulling for me, especially the women. And one of the things I remember very well is there was one person that worked in engineering. Her name was Sharon Hill. Sharon, when I knew nothing about engineering, and I was a very poor drafts person, but any work I turned in to her, she told me, don't worry about it, she says, because we are not going to let our black man fail. And so any work that I turned in, she made sure that when I turned it in, that she went over it with me and we made sure that it was correct and it went out correctly. So I feel very grateful for that. Nancy Harris happened to be the first black female hired within the telephone company, and also found at a later date who was responsible for that. And I understand that there was Minister Moyer. Between Sharon, Nancy, and several other black women, they helped me get through the everyday struggle that I had managing within the telephone company. Now, eventually, my philosophy was that even though I was catching all kind of hell from the non-Afro-Americans and some Afro-Americans within the company, because there were Afro-Americans in the company that felt that they should have been promoted. However, the only reason that I felt that they should have been promoted, but the only reason that they weren't promoted is because they were using that excuse that they weren't qualified with the education of a degree. I had both the experience, and then eventually when I graduated, I had the degree also. I found that when I had to draw on my military career to survive, and one of the things that when I went to work for them, when I was catching all of this hell from all angles, I made it quite clear to everyone that worked for me that you may not like me, and I don't care if you like me, but you damn sure are going to respect me. And so that was my policy. I based everything on that. Don't like me if you don't want to, but you're going to respect me.
How long were you with the company?
I was with the company 20 years. I retired from the telephone company after 20 years. After a few months, after they saw that, hey, they wasn't going to run me off. I wasn't going to give up, no matter what they did, even though they did things that were pretty dangerous. For instance, I had a ground crew out there one time, and a car pulled up to me and says, "Say, you got a crew working down the road there, and the sign says cars pull over to the left, but the crew was working on the left." And that could have been very dangerous. The sign should have been crew working on the right, and the traffic should have been pulling over to the left. But pulling over to the left and leaving the right clear. But the signs were telling them to do just the opposite. Well, I thanked the man. We went down and I got the sign straight. But these guys that were working out there, they were guys that had been working, doing this work 15, 13, 20 years. So they knew what they were doing. So they were purposely setting me up to fail. However, and those are the kind of things that I had to endure during that period of time. So every time I ran up against something like that, I made sure that I let them know I knew what they were doing. I wrote them up and documented it, and did the paperwork right, and eventually they got the message that he's not going anywhere. And then slowly but surely, they start giving me the respect of a manager, and that's all I wanted. I just wanted the respect as a manager, and slowly but surely I began to get that respect. And within a short period, within an 18-month period, they would start looking at me as a manager, someone that as a manager, and we start getting along, and that was the great thing about that. And what really made me feel good, because since I was able to break that cycle, shortly after that, the telephone company began to hire and promote within other black managers. I moved over into marketing, and then I got transferred to Baltimore, and that was my last assignment. And that's where I was when I finally retired. I was in Baltimore. They were offering packages to leave, and one of the packages I was offered one of the first packages, and that package contained full health benefits and the retirement pay. So to me, I thought about that. I had, I was young enough then. I got out of the Air Force at 37, and I went to work for a telephone company, and I worked another 20 years. So I think I was 37, 47, 50, I think it was about 59 years old. So I figured, well, I could even work another career. Sometimes things happen for the good, and you don't even realize it, because immediately after I retired from the telephone company, I came down with prostate cancer.